Welcome to the session on developer productivity as part of the New Future of Work track at the Microsoft Research Summit. I'm here with Dr. Denae Ford Robinson to discuss some of the things that are going to come up in this session. Denae is a senior researcher here at Microsoft Research and an affiliate assistant professor at the University of Washington. Her research focuses on how to build empathetic mechanisms for software engineers in online communities so that they can collaborate globally. So Denae, productivity has obviously been top of mind for everyone for the past year and a half. Can you tell us a little about how we measure it?
Yes, so information worker productivity in general is hard to define, but there are two key ways researchers try to approximate it. The first is through self-reported worker data, or asking people if they feel productive. And the second is worker activity data, or counting the number of emails sent, lines of code written, meetings had, information in this kind of space. In the context of developer productivity in particular, is really interesting to study because some of the work developers do is actually quite measurable. So one common developer productivity metric is a pull request, or PR, which is a mechanism for developers to notify team members that they have completed a feature.
Thanks. So obviously Microsoft cares a lot about developers. You know, at our core, what we do is we build software. In fact, we even build software that other people use to build software. Can you tell us a little bit about the ways we've been able to study developer productivity here at Microsoft?
For sure. So at Microsoft, we have a unique privilege to build tools for developers in addition to building them for the broader population. For developers in particular, we take an empirical approach to supporting them by using telemetry data, conducting user studies, distributing large-scale surveys, and to get a better sense of how they work now and how they may want to work in the future. During the pandemic, we've been able to draw on expertise from many parts of the company outside of Microsoft as well as academics. So for instance, we've been able to use insights from GitHub's public open source reports about how developers are contributing during the pandemic as we test our own hypotheses about the highs and lows of productivity that developers experience internally. So through sharing our own findings with the academic community and beyond, we've begun to create frameworks to understand a broader definition of what it means to be productive and what it looks like across multiple settings.
That's very interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to hear in this session?
Oh, all the great things. All the amazing things, actually. In today's session, we'll have talks discussing the joys and perils of working during the pandemic, ranging from gratitude, onboarding challenges, and what a new form of productivity looks like for our internal developer community. So our speakers include Dr. Jenna Butler, Senior Applied Research Scientist, Visiting Scholar at Microsoft Research, Brian Houck, who is a Principal Productivity Engineer in the Azure Engineering Systems. He helps improve developer productivity and well-being across all of Microsoft. And we have also Dr. Paige Rodeghero, who is an Assistant Professor at Clemson University and a recent Visiting Researcher at Microsoft Research. I'm honored to say I've had the privilege of working and collaborating with all of these amazing leaders, and our next session will certainly be a treat. Be sure to join us and follow up with the speakers with any questions you may have.
Hello, I'm Jenna Butler, Senior Applied Research Scientist at Microsoft. Today, I'll be discussing the challenges and gratitudes experienced by developers during the first year of work from home due to the COVID-19 pandemic. As a productivity researcher, I got a lot of questions when the pandemic was starting. Are developers still productive? Is this working? Do they like it? Myself and colleagues at Microsoft Research conducted an early study across the company and found that roughly 1/3 of people felt more productive during work from home. Roughly 1/3 felt about the same, and roughly 1/3 felt less productive. Not only that, but this study asked them what challenges and what benefits they experienced working from home. Some challenges reported, such as focus or the home work environment, were strong enough that they were related to a statistically significant drop in productivity. The interesting part? Focus and home work environment were also reported as benefits, with a statistically significant increase in productivity for those individuals. So which is it? Well, one way we're trying to answer this question is through a long-term longitudinal study on developers. The first week of work from home, we launched a daily diary study within one large group at Microsoft. We had hundreds of people enroll. They chose to enroll by selecting an anonymous username and then were sent nightly reminders to fill out a diary asking them about their challenges and gratitudes while working from home, and also reporting their daily satisfaction with their day. This diary study is still ongoing. At this point, we have over 75 weeks of entries, but this presentation will focus on the first year of data. We enrolled over 400 people and have received over 10,200 diaries to date. Each diary response includes the person's biggest challenge for the day, their gratitude for the day, as well as their overall satisfaction on a score from 1 to 5. Some people have stuck with the study so far for the entire 18 months. And in fact, we have a cohort of 22 engineers who've submitted over 100 diaries in the first year alone. So, what did they say? As we saw with the other Microsoft study I reported, it's all somewhat in the eye of the beholder. For example, there are verbatim quotes from people saying their biggest challenge is focus and connection, and also from people saying their greatest gratitude is focus and connection. For some people, being home means more distractions, like kids or the laundry calling your name. It might also mean feeling disconnected from people, especially if you live alone. However, if you do live alone, you might also find that it's easier to have long periods of focus without interruption. And for others, the chance to see family when they take breaks or pet their dog while working, these can lead to feeling more connected throughout the workday. And in fact, people can report the same thing as a challenge or a gratitude, depending on the day. So let's look deeper as to what the challenges are. Some of the challenges were consistent over the first year, while others changed. Early on, the biggest issue was too many meetings. When we went remote, we could no longer pop by an office or have a social lunch, and so therefore, every interaction had to be a meeting. Using our diary study, we quickly saw that this became overwhelming and untenable. Our organization instituted meeting-free Fridays and also suggested 5 to 10-minute gaps between every meeting. After instituting these changes, we saw that too many meetings declined and for the most part is not a major challenge anymore. Conversely, physical and mental well-being issues grew over time. Unfortunately, some weeks, more than 25% of challenges reported were in this space. Some of this was, of course, compounded by the ongoing situation. For example, many people thought work from home would be short and therefore never set up a proper workstation at home. Over time, this led to ergonomic issues such as sore hands or back. Also, obviously, this is not normal remote work, but rather work during a pandemic. As the pandemic raged on, many people got more stressed, anxious, alone, and were often dealing with grief and loss. Other problems like feeling overworked or having trouble focusing remained largely consistent over the year. Of course, we did ask people to report their daily gratitudes. The reason for this was actually twofold. We wanted to know what was working for people and help share best practices, but we also wanted to require a gratitude reflection. When we launched this study, we actually thought people were only going to be home for 2 weeks, and we thought it was going to be a very difficult, scary 2 weeks of pandemic, and we wanted to require a gratitude because many studies have shown that the act of reflecting on a gratitude itself can improve your well-being. Of course, it turned out to be much longer than that, and reporting gratitudes has helped some people throughout the study feel more in control during these unstable times. Just like the challenges, some gratitudes were initially high and decreased over time. We saw this most with the commute. People were thrilled to not have to commute at the beginning of the pandemic. As time wore on, this decreased. Some people just got used to commuting and it wasn't top of mind for them anymore. But for others, they actually missed the commute and reported this in their study. They missed that temporal and spatial boundary between work and home, a time to transition mentally. Microsoft has actually launched Viva Virtual Commute to help reestablish that boundary. Conversely, mental health increased as a gratitude. This category includes things like taking a break, seeing a therapist, feeling glad to be alive or present, or even going on vacation. Early in the pandemic, many people couldn't or didn't want to travel. Since, again, we thought it would be short, many workers banked their vacation days. As the pandemic stretched on, people needed to use these days and took staycations. While some people did report that it was harder to not work on your vacation when you're still in your home work environment, and that it was hard to come back to work when you're still technically in your vacation environment, many people were surprised to find the break rejuvenating. As the year went on, we also saw people reporting taking an active role to improve their mental health, such as by getting a counselor. And lastly, as the pandemic continued, people became more grateful for the fact that they could just work from home. Seeing loved ones lose their jobs or critical workers being potentially exposed to COVID every day, people were very grateful for the fact that they could choose to work from home in relative safety. Every diary entry also included satisfaction on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all satisfied and 5 being very satisfied with their work from home day. Currently, we're looking across different groups of people: female managers, male managers, designers, and individual contributors. These groups were selected because we had enough diaries in each category for group analysis. Looking at their satisfaction over time, female managers overall have had a slight increase in satisfaction, as have individual contributors. We also overlaid on this graph some key events for our population, which are largely US-based employees. For example, you can see the little dip in September 2020, the first month of a return to virtual school. You can also see the challenging time of the US election. Here in America, that was very much filled with social unrest. And during the weeks of the US Christmas and New Year's, we had very little data reported. Thankfully, people weren't working and did take some rest. We also report on this graph the weeks where Microsoft made major announcements of pushing back the return to work days. These were often met with gratitude from the employees, glad that they could stay home longer as the pandemic continued, but sometimes also caused a struggle as people were reminded of the reality of the ongoing pandemic. So the data we have thus far is of remote and hybrid work during a pandemic, so not exactly a picture of what the future will hold. That said, we can look back on this year of diary studies and see a very complicated and nuanced picture. Many software engineers find both positives and negatives with work from home, sometimes changing based on the day or the type of work they do. There is not a clear-cut answer to questions like, does work from home work for engineers? Or how many days a week should a hybrid team come in? However, we can answer the question, how do we maximize the benefits and minimize the side effects of hybrid work? And one answer to that is boundaries. Work from home, and more specifically the pandemic, basically decimated every natural boundary we had. We no longer had the physical boundary of the office for work and the living room for relaxing. We didn't have the boundary of school for children's education and home for playtime. We didn't have the 9-to-5 boundary of work because it could happen anytime. While every toddler believes that no boundaries is the key to freedom and fun, adults learn that boundaries are actually what keep you feeling safe. These quotes from diaries show how the lack of boundaries was exhausting or made the workday drag on, and people struggled with knowing how to set boundaries to deal with this. In the new world of hybrid work and radical flexibility on behalf of the individual, it will be more important than ever for information workers to know themselves and set their own boundaries. We are trying to build technology to support these. For example, something simple like headphones can help block out the sounds of home, so your brain can focus on one thing without multitasking every time it hears a child walking around upstairs. Viva Virtual Commute is a tool to help restore the end-of-day boundary, giving time for reflection, meditation, and a signal to the mind and body that the workday is done. Our own internal boundaries matter too. Feeling overwhelmed, having too many meetings, and physical and mental well-being are 3 of the top 5 challenges people have been facing. Know when you're willing to work and when you're not willing to give up. Use your calendar to schedule focus times and breaks, perhaps for exercise, and don't allow meetings to go over them. Lastly, set boundaries with others and within your team. We saw that after-hours instant messaging was up 52%, and for managers, this number skyrocketed to 300%. Managers also saw a 25% increase in after-hours meetings. For some people, this worked great. They wanted to enjoy the afternoon and dinner with their kids and then get back on working after bedtime. But for others, this meant the day stretched on endlessly. Only by communicating our needs, possibly through a team talk or even using Outlook to block breaks, can others know how to best work with us. Consider setting up a communication contract with the team and checking in on what's working now and what isn't. What's exciting about all of this is there doesn't appear to be much about remote work and hybrid work that is inherently bad. The challenges can be positives, and the many freedoms, if left unchecked, can be negatives. And for the most part, globally, we have yet to experience what true hybrid work looks like, free from the strain of a global pandemic. If we learn more about what types of works, environments, life stages, etc., are optimized by remote work and what types are hindered, we can actually have a future where we have the best of both worlds. And I'm thrilled to keep studying this space and building the technology to make that happen. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for joining me today for my session on how to be a happy and productive developer as we move into a new hybrid way of working. My name is Brian Houck, and I'm a productivity engineer in our Azure Engineering System team. And today, what I'm going to talk about are what are the tips that I share with my team as we are transitioning into a hybrid way of working. Tip number 1, work for a great manager. I cannot stress the importance of who you work for on your overall well-being and your productivity. Your manager really is the gateway to your success. And there's lots of evidence that we have seen here within Microsoft that helps support that. For example, we've seen that Microsoft employees who have regular one-on-ones with their direct manager are 2.5 times more likely to report maintaining or improving their productivity and work-life balance as we had shifted into remote work. And what this really illustrates is the importance of managers at providing support, helping with prioritization, and doing things like removing roadblocks. We actually have been able to see that manager is the number 1 most important job factor to our internal software developers. This is ahead of things like how much you get paid or what you're working on. And people are willing to vote with their feet to find the right manager for them. We've actually seen that nearly half of all internal job transfers amongst Microsoft developers are to either leave a manager you don't like or to follow a manager that you do like. And from all of this, we've been able to build sort of a grocery list of what are top factors to look for in a great software engineering manager. Now, this is very personal, and so the weighting of these factors may be very different individual to individual, but some of the really consistent themes are things like, the manager has to have enough time available in order to provide that support we just talked about. They need to be able to grow a healthy and inclusive team culture. They need to be able to clear out those barriers, again, that I just mentioned. And they need to be able to provide enough autonomy and individual freedom to express your creativity without being micromanaged. So my next tip is to make every second count. Really fight for every minute of productive time. There is plenty of research out there that shows the importance of having time available for focused work on productivity, and that is definitely true for developers too. As you can see on the chart on the right, every blue dot represents a development team of roughly 300 to 400 developers. And we can see a positive relationship between those teams that have more time available for focused work and returning that focused time into development activity. And we measure this development time by looking at application usage of development tools like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. And so that increased focus time really means more time writing code, which we also know means that developers are going to feel more productive. And so this begs the question, where is this time coming from? Well, one place that this time can come from is to stop attending low-quality meetings. We see a strong negative relationship between multitasking in meetings and actually doing development work. And so if you find yourself in a meeting where you're multitasking, that's not being productive. All that is a sign that you were in a meeting that you probably didn't need to be in to begin with. And I don't necessarily think that this is a causal relationship, but I do believe that is an indication of a potential cultural problem that developers may feel a pressure to attend meetings just for the sake of attending them, even if they don't have anything to contribute. And again, a lot of this comes back to managers. Managers who do a lot of multitasking in meetings are going to have teams that do a lot of multitasking in meetings because that's the example that's been set. And so as we look for places to do more focused work, certainly it is by removing some of these lower quality meetings. What it is not a good place to look is to stretch your days longer. So we see that teams that do a lot of after-hour collaboration, so this is things like attending meetings or sending IMs, responding to emails outside of your own core working hours, there's a negative relationship between that after-hours collaboration and overall work-life satisfaction. It's logical, but it's great to be able to measure that because developers at Microsoft who aren't happy with their work-life boundaries also report being less productive. And as we move into a more hybrid way of working that may mean we are more geographically dispersed, it's important to look for those conducive times between you and your peers that fits within everyone's working hours. What is that Venn diagram? So a actual practice that my team has implemented in order to find more time for focused work is to implement a monthly meeting-free day. And we've been able to go and measure those results. And what we found is by having an org-wide meeting-free day, on those meeting-free days, it actually removed meetings for our employees. In fact, the typical engineer was in 0 hours of meetings on that day. In fact, nearly 90% of all of our engineers were in 1 hour or less of meetings. And that represented a substantial reduction in overall meeting volume for that day, even after seasonal adjustments. And it's not just that those meetings were moved to other days of the week. The actual total meeting load for that week was reduced. And so it did result in a reduction in meetings, a real meaningful reduction. And as you would expect, that reduction was returned to more focused time for work. And really important to note that this reduction in meeting did not seem to come from cutting out high quality meetings like those one-on-ones with your direct manager. They actually came from reducing more redundant meetings that did not need to have as many people in them. And also important to note that this reduction in meetings was experienced by both our individual software developers as well as our L1 and L2 managers. And so having a shared experience of reducing meetings was able to provide more focused time for work for all of our employees. And my final tip today is really to choose the right development tools. And this one is a little bit tougher, I know, because not all of you developers have full autonomy in what tools you use. And so you could also imagine this tip as put pressure on your engineering system to provide the right tools for you as we move into hybrid work. What we have found during the transition to remote work can teach us a lot about some of the challenges we can expect for hybrid work. The majority of our Microsoft engineers reported difficulty with having reliable connectivity during remote work, and also not having the right power of hardware while working from home. And we've also seen that a quarter of our developers are always working on a local machine. And as we think about moving to hybrid, all of these become tougher challenges in some ways, because if I am moving on a given day between being on-site versus being remote, the portability of my development environment becomes more important, and ensuring that regardless of where I am, I have the compute power I need to do my development work and the connectivity I need. And so here at Microsoft, we're doing things like investing in GitHub code spaces to provide cloud-powered development environments where that more computationally intensive work can happen in the cloud, where we have fat internet pipes, and then developers can just use a more portable laptop instead of a beefy dev machine sitting under their desk in order to do their actual core dev work. And as always, the intuitiveness and general usability of our tools continues to be critically important. We do see a large number of our Azure engineers state that the usability of their core development tools are a primary driver of dissatisfaction with their overall engineering system. And that has implications for things like retention and overall job satisfaction. But all hope is not lost. In our engineering system team, we have seen that sustained and dedicated investments into improving the usability of our tools to provide a more consistent user experience where maybe you're not always having to manually move context around or hop across authentication barriers. By having a more consolidated workflow with that consistent user experience, we've actually been able to improve the amount of time per day that developers spend developing by nearly 8%. And that comes from just reducing that friction with tools. And as we move towards a more hybrid world and we think about the next generation of tools in order to blend remote and on-site work, I just encourage everyone to continue thinking about not just the utility of our development tools, but also their usability. And so as I close out my session today, a couple of thoughts that I have for you is just be willing to learn and adapt as we transition into this new hybrid way of working. We are going to know a lot more a year from now than we do today about what it takes to be successful in hybrid work. And be willing to try new things and to fail, and that's okay. That's how we learn how to get better, and just go into it with an open mindset. And don't get discouraged. When we transitioned into remote work, it was a very difficult change for many people for lots of different reasons. And a focus on your own well-being is a focus on your productivity. And I want to stress that as well. And so with that, I thank you so much for joining me with my session today. Have a nice day.
Hello, my name is Dr. Paige Rodeghero, and today I'll be talking about remote onboarding software developers and hybrid work for students. Remote onboarding of software developers is where we're going to start. I have a paper with Dr. Thomas Zimmerman, Brian Houck, Denae Ford from Microsoft Research that we studied programmers during the pandemic and onboarding at Microsoft, and so we're going to start talking about that first today. So we asked the question early on in the pandemic, what was the remote onboarding experience of Microsoft software engineers who onboarded during the COVID-19 pandemic? And we had 4 research questions that we looked into. The first was, what are the challenges that developers encountered when onboarding during the pandemic? The second, what are teams doing to onboard new hires? The third, how do team members interact with new hires during the pandemic? And finally, the 4th question we asked was, do new hires feel socially connected to their team? Our methodology for this work includes sending out a survey to full-time employees that had recently onboarded at Microsoft. We did a quantitative analysis on the questions that were asked, and we performed open coding on the data collected, doing a qualitative analysis as well. After doing the survey, we conducted interviews with new hires and early career employees at Microsoft. So the survey consisted of sending about 1,000, or exactly 1,000 emails for recruitment, and from that 1,000 emails, we got 267 responses. All of these emails were sent to new employees at Microsoft that were full-time that had onboarded during the pandemic. They were all from North America due to the different timelines of the pandemic lockdowns and the spread of the virus, and their start date had to be in 2020. All the participants that we interviewed or surveyed were working at home at the time that we sent the survey out. Of the participants, we had 57 women, 162 men, and 1 non-binary and gender diverse participant. So looking at the research question 1, looking at the pandemic onboarding challenges, we found that the main challenges that onboarding had was that the individuals struggled with communication and collaboration with their team and project. They struggled with asking for help because they were not in person, so they were not able to just walk over to someone's desk and ask for help. They struggled building connections with their teams. Everyone was working on different hours, maybe having to do childcare, and so when a newcomer came into the team, they may not have been able to meet with all the teammates like normal in person because some of their teammates may have had to do homeschooling and daycare. Another challenge they faced was finding documentation on the project that they were working on. They had technical issues up front and hardware and permission issues as well that had to be solved remotely. And those all were the main challenges that we found with the new hires onboarding and the team that they were working with during that time. And so some of the quotes that we saw were really eye-opening. I just want to talk about 3 quotes that we found on this challenge from this data. And the first one is that onboarding remotely is definitely more challenging. The inability to truly interact with coworkers, the inability to really have traditional team building, and the disconnection from everyone contributes to feeling like my work is kind of isolated from everyone else's. It also makes it harder to get a broader, high-level understanding of the team and organization. So this quote we found resonated with a lot of other quotes that we analyzed. A lot of people struggled building these connections and feeling isolated from their team. And that was a very common occurrence throughout the new hires. Another response was that during meetings, most teammates kept the camera off. This makes collaboration and remote experience difficult. This also showed up quite a bit in our data. And additionally, we found that in our interviews, managers and new hires would mention that keeping the camera off made it difficult to collaborate and have remote collaboration experiences. And finally, another quote from the data was that because everyone is working from home, I don't run into people randomly or walk by their office, which has led me to ask for less help than I usually would have because I don't like asking small, half thought out questions virtually. This, again, another quote that represents the data that we have collected. A lot of newcomers mentioned that they weren't able to just walk in the hallway, have one of those water cooler moments where they are able to ask informally questions about work and just run into people in the hallways or in the parking lot. So looking at the second research question, we looked at the team onboarding efforts. And so we asked, what has the team done to make you feel connected to the team? We had 6 different things show up that was common throughout our data. So first is frequent one-on-one meetings with the manager. Having a remote team meeting the first day, that was very common in our data. Checking in to prevent blockages, this is by the manager and by other teammates. Social virtual events, having an onboarding buddy, and being assigned a mentor. One of the quotes that stood out to us, and that represents a lot of the data we collected, is as follows. The team has been extremely welcoming. My very first day we met over Teams and each person introduced themselves and welcomed me personally. Several people have reached out to ask how my onboarding is going and offered to answer any questions I have. Several members of my team invited me to join them in a hackathon. Generally, everyone has been incredibly helpful and patient when teaching me. So looking at the team versus the new hires here, we looked at the team interactions with new hires and what those looked like. We found that the new hires reported that they had one-on-one meetings daily, and that was about 60% of our respondents. These meetings and communications typically focus on work-related topics and not social topics. About 70%, a little over 70% of the communications that they had with their teams were less than 30 minutes, and a little bit more than 40% of communication was less than 15 minutes with their team. One of the quotes we found in our data that answers this question well is that formally there are scheduled meetings, but mostly with the whole team, but I do have a scheduled one-on-one with my manager. There are informal chats and some email exchanges between me and individuals to help me. This was fairly consistent throughout our data. The one-on-ones were extremely common with the manager, and those were weekly meetings throughout our data. And so our fourth research question, we look at the social connection to the team. And we found that 83% of new hires felt connected to their team. One of our quotes, I try to reach out to random team members. I'm soon going to ask my manager if people can start turning on their cameras so I can see facial expressions. Another, unfortunately, I guess I haven't taken active steps to do so since I feel like I'm spending all of my time trying to ramp up and learn. We found that there was a large, significant connection with the new hires and their teams in this data. However, there were outliers where people, like the second quote, had not had time to spend connecting with their team, and others that were waiting to get back into office. So from this data, we take in our observations, we have some recommendations for our remote onboarding. The first is to promote communication asking for help. This is by the manager and by other teammates. Encourage teams to turn on their cameras, schedule one-on-one meetings, and have those be weekly. Provide information to new hires about the organization and how the hierarchy of the organization works. Emphasize team building and do this regularly to create, build, and maintain team connection. Assign an onboarding buddy to a new hire. Assign an onboarding technical mentor to a new hire. Maybe the buddy comes from a different team and the mentor comes from the team within. Support multiple onboarding speeds. Some new hires may have different experiences, and some might come straight from college and they might have different needs. So having support for different onboarding speeds is necessary to keep a new hire on task and able to become a productive team member quickly. Assign a simple first task, and finally provide up-to-date documentation. So looking at all of this work, we started thinking about how to prepare students for hybrid work. And this is a work in progress. We have initial recommendations based on our previous work. So the first, similar to the last recommendation, is just promote communication in the classroom. So we're preparing students for hybrid work. And so we need to prepare them to be able to communicate through remote work and virtual work, and to have the ability to collaborate remotely. We need to encourage hybrid collaboration within the education system, emphasize team building both in person and virtually. Again, this is something that we're still working on, and we believe that more work needs to be conducted to further understand how to best prepare students. But we know that this is a new way of working, and we need to change the way that we are teaching our students and prepare them to work in this new future of hybrid work. From our work on remote work on programmers and onboarding and students, we have 4 publications covering this, and I will just leave these here on the slide that for anyone that wants to further dive into this work. And we're always looking for collaborators, and again, we're working on this new future of work for education and better understanding how to prepare students. So if you're interested, please contact me, and I'd love to chat more about that. Thank you so much for attending this presentation.